Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. And tonight we're going to talk about the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah, Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself. Okay, I was very interested to read this narrative, this slave narrative, in comparison to the other two narratives that we have covered on this channel, the life of the slave girl, Harriet Jacobs, and the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. Now, one of the very important things that I got out of reading the narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano was he was not born in the U.S. He was born in Africa. He was captured, put on the slave ship, survived the Middle Passage, and was sent to the Caribbean. And he experienced slavery in the Caribbean, and he also experienced slavery in the U.S. And his take on slavery and the way he dealt with it was very much different than how Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs dealt with slavery. And we'll talk about that towards the end of this video. But in the beginning of this narrative, it was very interesting how Olaudah Equiano, and I'm just going to refer to him as Equiano because I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce his first name. And in the narrative, he didn't refer to himself with his African name. What was very interesting at the beginning of this narrative was his description of Africa. He gave a very positive view of Africa, and he's from Nigeria. He talked about his tribe, and he made it seem like Africa was a paradise. But what I found interesting was he talked about slavery in Africa, which when we talk about slavery here in the U.S., we like to reference that the slavery in Africa was not the same as the slavery in America. And according to Gustavus Vasa, or according to Equiano, I will just read a section where he describes slavery in Africa, which and this is in reference to slaves that weren't sold to Europeans. Okay, those prisoners which were not sold or redeemed we kept as slaves. But how different was their condition from that of the slaves in the West Indies? With us they do no more work than other members of the community, even their masters. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly the same as theirs, except that they were not permitted to eat with those who were free-born. And there was scarce any other difference between them than a superior. So I found that pretty interesting. And he talked about how they earned their names and how his name Olaudah meant fortune or vicissitude, or one favored and having a loud voice. And what was really interesting and why I wanted to read this narrative was to get a picture of the Middle Passage. But before we get to the Middle Passage, I recommend that everyone read this narrative because he talks about how in Africa, after he describes how much of a paradise it was, he talks about how he was captured by Africans. And when I say Africans, I mean he was captured by his own countrymen and women. I found that very interesting. He was very honest that he said that in his land, children had to look out for men and women, his own countrymen who were out capturing slaves or out capturing Africans to be sold as slaves. And he was captured at age 11 by his own countrymen. And he talks about traveling as a captured slave on his way to the slave ships. And he said that the languages of the Africans that he encountered around the journey were, their languages were not very much different than his own. So it was not like a very long voyage that he was taking from his homeland to the coast if the languages of the people that he was encountering were similar to his own. And then he talks about what he saw on the Middle Passage. Now, once he got to the slave ship, that's where he encountered the Europeans. And I did another video that talked about Africans selling slaves to the Europeans, and in many instances the Europeans just parked the boat and just waited for deals that they had made with African kings to just bring their prisoners to the boat. So the slave traders on many occasions did not have to do much work at all until the slaves arrived to their ships in the hundreds and sometimes the thousands. And Equiano does talk about tribal warfare inflicted by many chiefs to take prisoners to sell to Europeans. He talked about that. He said that happened on large scale. So this is something that we don't have to argue because we're getting it right from the slave narrative himself. And it's terrible to read that. But he talks about what he saw on the slave ship during the Middle Passage, and I'll read a section. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment that, if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them all to have exchanged my conditions with that of the meanest slave in my own country. The white people looked and acted as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty, and this is not only shown toward us blacks, but also to some of the whites themselves. One white man in particular I saw, when we were permitted to be on deck, flogged so unmercifully with a large rope near the foremast that he died in consequence of it. And they tossed him over the side as they would have done a brute. This made me fear these people the more, and I expected nothing less than to be treated in the same manner. I have even known them gratify their brutal passion with females not 10 years old. And these abominations, some of them practiced to such scandalous excess that one of our captains discharged the mate and others on that account. So these are some of the things that he saw on the Middle Passage, and he describes the other things that we who have studied slavery in some extent. He talked about the sickness, living under deck, people packed in so tight in their own feces and their own vomit, and just the horrid conditions. And when let on deck, he talked about how they kept the slaves from literally trying to just jump overboard to their deaths. Some of them succeeded. Equiano wanted to do the same. But it's very interesting to read about the Middle Passage. I believe he was 11 years old during the time. So it's through his eyes from 11 years old. Now, today we talk a lot about American descendants of slavery. We got the ADOS movement. And we differentiate the black Americans from Africans and black people from other countries. These narratives show the origin of that, because Equiano, once he left Africa and went through the Middle Passage and spent some time with his master, he ended up in England. He fell in love with England. He fell in love with his master. And he had no intentions of returning to Africa. It's very interesting that on many occasions, or a few occasions, he had opportunities to run away to freedom, and he chose to just stay out his term as a slave, because his masters told him that if he raised a certain amount of money in the West Indies, they would free him. But before he made that sum of money, there were some instances where he said, I could have literally walked away and been a free man, and he decided to remain in his circumstance to win his freedom. And when he did win his freedom, instead of going back to Africa, he chose to go back to England to his old master. I don't understand this infatuation that he had with his old master. And let me just read to you an excerpt. I would see old England once more and surprise my old master, Captain Pascal, who was hourly in my mind, for I still loved him, notwithstanding his usage of me, and I pleased myself with thinking of what he would say when he saw what the Lord had done for me in so short a time, instead of being, as he might perhaps suppose, under the cruel yoke of some planter. So I don't understand this. And another difference is when Equiano was a slave, he was implemented many times in transferring other slaves from the West Indies to America, and he did not view all slaves the same. He treated his countrymen better than he treated other slaves, which I really didn't like, how he differentiated the slaves based on their country. And there was an instance where he was transferring slaves, the ship wrecked, and instead of freeing the slaves as Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs would have definitely done, he secured them and helped get them back in line to be sold in America. I believe they were going to Georgia. So the slave born in America, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, and their narratives, they're so reason for writing their narratives was to free every last person in bondage. Equiano does not mention anywhere in his narrative where he wants to free all the slaves from bondage. There was a very long and drawn out chapter, maybe more than one chapter. I mean, it was very long and drawn out, where he was practicing Christianity and trying to perfect his Christian being. And that part of his narrative was not very interesting at all to me. But what was interesting, that once he secured his freedom and he decided to go from the West Indies back to England, back to his master, he was to be sent to Africa as a missionary. And he didn't want to go. He did not want to go back to Africa. So this is very interesting to me, because at the very beginning of his narrative, he describes Africa as a paradise. When he was captured and traveled, and when he was being sent to the slave ship, he wanted to go back home. But after he was enslaved, he fell in love with England and his master. His master double-crossed him, because his master fell into some financial difficulties and sold Equiano against the laws of England at that time, when he should have freed him. And that's what Equiano was talking about when he said, notwithstanding his usage of me, when he was returning back to England. But again, Equiano was to be sent to Africa as a missionary, and he was forced to go to Africa as a missionary, because he didn't want to go back to Africa. And another thing that I noticed, that when Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs talked about blacks and slavery, they used the term we need to do this, and they would say that they did certain things or withheld certain information to protect all of the slaves, or those in the future who would follow their paths to freedom. Equiano, none of this was in his narrative. He was all about himself. You can see where the root of the ADOS and the other blacks was from, because now I will say that the slavery in the U.S. was a lot more brutal than the slavery witnessed in the West Indies, according to Equiano's narrative. But he does say that he witnessed brutality and very hard work in the West Indies. But he himself traveled carrying slaves to Georgia, and each time he was in Georgia, he was attacked. But he kept returning on his own will, because he was given the choice, and he would take those hard jobs to transfer other slaves to other plantations. So I recommend that everyone read all three slave narratives, so you could just see the difference between Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs. Frederick Douglass, very masculine narrative as a man. Harriet Jacobs, a lot, in my opinion, a lot better written than Frederick Douglass. A lot more descriptive from a woman's point of view. And she gives examples that women would experience more than men. and then read Olaudah Equiano and compare them. And it's very important because you'll just see the total difference being born as a slave, seeing yourself as black and in bondage, and that being a unifying factor between you and all black people. And then Olaudah Equiano, born in Africa, belonging to a certain tribe, having certain countrymen, and he did not see himself as a slave in bondage, unifying him with all the rest of the slaves. And that's very disturbing to us ADOS, us American descendants of slavery. And this is a very important part of the argument when we do get in arguments about slavery, because we just haven't read this particular narrative. Because he talks about, he didn't put white people in a very bad light, because he ended up becoming institutionalized and becoming one of them. So again, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself. Again, this is Jason Williams with Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.